willingness to pay to justify the fixed cost of entering that market. But that's not true if we charge marginal cost prices. If we charge marginal cost prices, those could be like almost nothing. How the heck do we know whether this wasn't just a total boondoggle that some politician wanted, rather than something that was actually economically beneficial, right? So that's another problem with marginal cost pricing. Okay. So another problem with marginal cost regulation is what's called capture or corruption, right? Regulation can easily become a means of corruption. If regulators get cozy with those that they regulate, right, given that they're interacting with them a lot more than the public is, it may be easy for them to control them. Consumers are diffuse, whereas the regulated firm has a very concentrated interest in getting a lot of subsidies, right? And there's quite a lot of evidence that this happens. Organized consumer groups can definitely help, but when things are opaque, it may be hard for those consumer groups to really figure out what's going on. Now, it's not so clear that this is really any different than the informational problems I've been talking about, because what creates opacity, what makes it hard for the consumer groups to monitor, is precisely that there's things that are hard to know about what's going on in the industry. There are costs that are hard to observe, and when there are, it's very easy for the regulator to sort of get in bed with the firm. So the more transparency, the more you can try to solve this type of a problem, right? Okay. So to address some of these concerns, what's typically done is rather than having marginal cost efficient pricing, instead there's average cost pricing, or what's sometimes called rate of return or cost plus regulation. The reason it's called rate of return or cost plus is that usually the costs that are thought of initially are not the costs of raising the capital to build the firm, but all the other costs. And once you take into account the costs of raising the capital, like that you have to pay some interest on debt, you have some like rate of return that you allow those people to earn on their capital to make sure that they'd be willing to provide the financing, usually the equity financing, in order to create the firm. Okay. So a simple model of this is to just say, well, let's put all those capital costs into the cost, and let's just model this as being average cost pricing, right? So we're going to talk a bunch about the costs of marginal cost, of average cost pricing relative to marginal cost pricing. But first, I wanted to think about what are the benefits that average cost pricing might have over marginal cost pricing. So Charlie, what are some of those benefits?
One is you don't need the subsidy. So like for example, that last example where do you really need this industry?
Exactly.
Any best average cost.
Yeah, that's a very good, that's one very good thing. It's often easier to measure average costs, right? Because again, you just need to do an accounting audit to like see all the things they're spending money on. Now they could lie about those, but it's a little harder to hide that than to convince them that your marginal cost is X or Y, right? Because marginal cost is like what happens when you change production rather than what are your current costs. So average cost pricing really lessens the informational problem that the regulator faces, right? So rate of return regulation is one way of implementing regulated monopoly. State ownership is another way to do it, if you require that the state companies don't lose money, right? So rate of return regulation of private firms is a more common solution in the OECD, especially the United States. But really, whether state ownership or private ownership is the mode is less important in many ways than whether the thing is required to recoup its the amount of money that was put into it, or whether it's subsidized. So if you think about like GM and Chrysler, the government saved them, but they basically required them to pay back all the money the government had put in, right? In some ways, by requiring them to pay back the money the government had put in, that was actually much closer to like having a private ownership. And in fact, in order to do that, they had to run it really in an efficient private way. Whereas if you had instead said, well, this is a public good, we'll subsidize you guys, and then you just have to charge marginal cost prices, that would have been more efficient in some ways, but it would have, of course, run a lot more like a state-owned company, even if it had been private, fully private, but just given these subsidies, right? So this is often a private for-profit company. So for example, Community Edison or something like that, what's ComEd at Stanford? Commonwealth Edison in Chicago runs the electrical utilities, right? And ComEd is actually owned by a whole consortium of different utilities that are owned by the public, right? And then there's a regulatory board, either state, local, or federal, that oversees these people. And they're made up of experts, some economists, some technical experts, and so forth, that try to figure out what these guys' costs actually are and hold their rates down to that point so they don't make too much profit on the back of the public. Sometimes they initially auction the right to be to own this regulated monopoly. So for example, the Federal Communications Commission auctions the right to have a monopoly over some area of spectrum. And that was what Paul Milgram was talking about here last week. They then have an extensive team of auditors to sort of monitor prices and costs and so forth. And then they commission extensive research and studies into economics related to the pricing. So for example, there's a famous book by Bob Wilson about nonlinear pricing and how that should be done, which we'll talk about when we talk about price discrimination, that was commissioned by a regulatory board in one of the states. Okay. Now, these regulators usually have economic goals, but they often also have some political goals. And David Mao, what do you think some of the conflicted goals that one of these regulatory bodies might have would be?
They care about other things, like the environment.
Yeah. Yeah. So they often care about environmental protection. They care about like equity, like distributional concerns among consumers, protection of politically important groups, and that can undermine some of their efficacy as economic regulators. Okay. So average cost regulation is common in many areas of the economy. Does anyone want to give some examples of average cost regulation and where it's applied? Yeah, and
We talked about a few like utilities and public transportation.
Yep, absolutely. Those are good examples. Some public transport takes subsidies, and so it's really more like marginal cost regulation. But some actually have to recoup a large part of the cost, so it's closer to average cost regulation. Telecommunications in the United States until the mid-1980s was regulated. And in fact, local calling was forced to be subsidized, and then they recouped their costs on long-distance calling. Now, AT&T was broken up in the 1980s and forced to give access to competing local firms. But now there's been a whole bunch of mergers in that industry. And so we're actually close to going back to the old Ma Bell system where there was just a monopoly. Also, even when things aren't explicitly regulated, in some countries, not so much in the United States, you can sue a company if they're charging too high prices, like prices that are abusively profitable or something like that. And even though that's not exactly regulation, it's basically the same effect. It's like if you're charging too much, you're making too much profit, then they slap you down. That sort of forces you to charge prices that are closer to your average cost, right? Okay. And that might sound a little bit weird from the US perspective, but actually, you know, when there's like a hurricane and people try to charge a high price for goods to try to get the market to clear, often they'll be accused of price gouging or something like that, which is almost some form of average cost regulation, right? Okay. So average cost pricing can arise from these regulatory interventions. It can arise from these less formal regulatory interventions, like we were talking about, like suing someone for abusive pricing. It can also just arise from the fact that anytime there's profits to be had in an industry, that will attract other firms to enter, right? And remember, we said that free entry really only occurs when there's a large number of equally able managers. When all these people have easy access to capital, and it's not sort of like there's no rocket science about starting the firm in the industry. Sort of anyone can do it. And there's no barriers to entry, right? Under those circumstances, any profit that an incumbent is making will attract entrants. Now, that's not true in a natural monopoly setting, but in settings that are more, that have less fixed costs, then there may well be entry that holds things down to average cost, right? And that leads to average cost pricing, right? So average cost pricing can arise from regulation, can arise from lawsuits. It could also arise from a free entry equilibrium without any regulation, right? Now, this is a very common assumption that economists make. Perhaps it's not so realistic because of heterogeneity in firms' ability to start a company, but it's a useful benchmark and sort of way of thinking about things at first. So in some cases, at least, competition will mimic average cost pricing. Okay. So obviously, average cost is not the same thing as marginal cost. And that naturally leads to a distortion, right? In particular, average cost pricing is not efficient. And when marginal cost pricing leads to losses, that's precisely because marginal cost is below average cost, right? And that will mean that average cost pricing leads to a higher price and lower quantity, and therefore an inefficiently low quantity of the good being produced, right? So this is not all that different from the monopoly distortion, but it's not as extreme. Because the wedge between average cost and marginal cost is going to always be smaller than the wedge between price and marginal revenue, right? But we can measure things in a very similar way. In fact, remember that we looked at that formula before. The slope of the average cost curve is going to be equal to the difference between marginal and average cost divided by quantity. And so average cost minus the marginal cost is the negative of the slope of the average cost curve times quantity, right? So that tells us that the distortion, the wedge between the average cost and marginal cost, is proportional to the size of the market, just as in the monopoly case, but also to the slope of the average cost curve now, rather than to the slope of the price curve, right? So this is just like the monopoly, except now it's the slope of the average cost curve rather than the slope of the demand curve that creates the distortion, right? Now remember that it's possible to have natural monopoly with marginal cost greater than average cost, just as in this case I showed over here. And we'll come back to that case in a second. So just to see this, imagine that we have this declining average cost curve. Then we'll have a marginal cost curve that declines more quickly, twice as quickly, right? And the social optimum will be where demand intersects marginal cost, but the average cost pricing will give us this point where demand intersects average cost. And we'll have a social loss from that given by this area of the Harberger triangle here. Okay. So while this is sort of the most classical distortion that comes from average cost pricing, there's others that are perhaps at least as important. So one is market collapse or the fail of a firm to enter an industry even when it's efficient. So average cost pricing could lead a firm not to enter the industry even when it would be beneficial for them to enter the industry. And David Mao, why would that happen? Why would, under average cost pricing, a firm potentially not be able to enter the industry even though it's efficient for them to do so?
Because the price is different than the efficient, like the price isn't the efficient price. So they could
Well, but that wouldn't necessarily change whether they enter the industry or not, right? That would lead to a reduction in the quantity. But why would that stop them from even coming into the industry?